The house cat who adopted a bobcat, a true story that silenced a town. The photograph arrived at the Willow Creek Gazette office on a Tuesday morning in April, slipped under the door in a plain manila envelope with no return address. Sarah Chen, the editor, held it up to the window light and squinted. An orange tabby cat curled against something spotted and wild. She reached for her reading glasses. The bobcat kitten was unmistakable. White spots scattered across tawny fur, ears too large for its small head, paws that would grow massive. The house cat pressed against it like a mother shields a child from winter wind. Both animals slept on what looked like a faded quilt, the kind with hand-stitched squares that grandmothers make. The porch boards beneath them were weathered gray, and in the background, a pair of work boots stood beside a walking cane. Sarah reached for her phone. By Wednesday afternoon, the story had spread through Willow Creek like water finding cracks in old stone. At Mabel's coffee house on Main Street, three women leaned across a corner table. Voices hushed but urgent. Harold Green, Martha's husband. Martha's been gone, 5 years now? 6. It'll be 6 years this August. Poor man, that house must feel like a tomb. Well, apparently he's keeping wild animals now. The bell above the door chimed. More customers entered, saw the newspaper on the counter, picked it up. The photograph drew their eyes like a magnet. Some shook their heads, others smiled. A few bought extra copies to show their neighbors. At the Green Farm, 3 miles outside town where the road turned from asphalt to gravel, Harold stood at his kitchen window watching a pickup truck slow near his mailbox. The driver craned his neck toward the house. Harold stepped back from the glass. The truck moved on. Pumpkin wound between his ankles. Purring. The sound was familiar as his own heartbeat. Martha had brought her home 22 years ago, a scrap of orange fur in a cardboard box, saying she'd found her behind the church. Martha had always been finding things, bringing them home, nursing them back to health. Birds with broken wings, fawns separated from their mothers. Once, a fox kit whose den had been destroyed by logging equipment. After Martha died, Pumpkin had stopped sleeping on the bed. For months she'd curled in the doorway instead, as if waiting for Martha to walk through. Harold had understood. He'd spent those same months waking at dawn, reaching across sheets that stayed cold, forgetting for those first few seconds that he was alone. The bobcat kitten had appeared 3 weeks ago. Harold had walked out to collect the newspaper and found Pumpkin on the porch, washing something that at first he'd thought was a rat. Then it had moved, mewling, and Harold's breath had caught. Pumpkin had looked up at him with those amber eyes that held no explanation. Only certainty. This is mine now, the look said. Accept it, Harold had accepted it. He'd called the wildlife services. Of course. Left a message. They'd called back 2 days later saying they were short-staffed. That spring was their busiest season. That if the animal seemed healthy and the mother hadn't returned, he should bring it to the shelter in Asheville. That was 40 miles away. Harold's truck had been making a grinding noise. The kitten was nursing from Pumpkin, who had recently weaned her own litter, and seemed content. So Harold had waited. 1 day became 3. 3 became a week. The kitten grew stronger. Pumpkin moved it from the porch to the mudroom. To the corner behind the washing machine, where it was dark and warm, Harold brought blankets. Pumpkin arranged them with her paws until they suited her. Now a second truck was slowing near the mailbox. This one stopped. A man got out with a camera. Harold moved to the front door, opened it, and stood on the porch. The man saw him and waved, raising the camera. Harold shook his head once, a clear gesture. The man lowered the camera, hesitated, then got back in his truck. Harold waited until the engine started and the vehicle pulled away before going back inside. Pumpkin sat in her usual spot in the living room, in the square of sunlight that moved across the floor throughout the day. The bobcat kitten, which Harold had started calling Whisker for the exceptionally long white whiskers that swept back from its face, lay sprawled against her, belly exposed, paws twitching in sleep. Pumpkin's tongue moved methodically over the spotted fur, pausing occasionally to bite gently at a tangle. Harold settled into his reading chair. The leather cracked and shaped to his body after 40 years of use. Martha's chair sat across from his, empty except for the knitting basket still tucked beside it. He tried sitting in her chair once, the week after the funeral. It had felt like trespassing. The phone rang. Harold let it ring. The answering machine clicked on. His own voice, recorded years ago, asked callers to leave a message. A woman's voice began speaking, something about a television station in Raleigh, an interest in interviewing him. He deleted it without listening to the end. By evening, 4 more vehicles had driven slowly past. 2 had parked. Harold had stood on the porch until they left. He was not an unkind man, but neither was he inclined toward spectacle. Martha would have laughed at all of this. She would have invited the reporters in, made them coffee, told them stories about every animal they'd ever sheltered. She would have turned it into something warm and human. Harold just wanted them to leave. That night, Whisker followed Pumpkin outside for the first time. Harold watched from the window as Pumpkin led the kitten down the porch steps, pausing on each one to let Whisker navigate the height. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light. Pumpkin moved toward the edge of the woods, Whisker tumbling after her, uncoordinated but determined. They disappeared into the tree line. Harold's chest tightened. He waited. Minutes passed. He was about to get his flashlight when Pumpkin emerged, Whisker behind her. They crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps, and slipped through the cat door Harold had installed decades ago. The soft thump of the flap falling back into place was the most comforting sound he had heard all day. The cars came again on Thursday. By Friday, there were people on foot, walking up his driveway. Harold met them at the edge of his property, his cane in hand not for walking but for emphasis. He was 74 years old and had worked construction for 40 of those years. He was still a man people did not argue with. "Private property," he said. "Appreciate you respecting that." Most turned back. A few tried to engage him in conversation. He repeated himself, voice level, and eventually they left. But there were always more. On Saturday morning, he found a note taped to his mailbox. The handwriting was careful, each letter formed with attention. "Thank you for showing us something beautiful. You don't need to share anything more. Just thank you." It was signed The Hendersons, Route 7. Harold folded the note and put it in his shirt pocket. That afternoon, he walked into town for the first time since the newspaper article. He needed groceries. He could have asked Tommy from the feed store to deliver, but that felt like hiding, and Harold had never been one to hide. Mabel's coffee house was packed. Conversation stopped when he entered. Harold nodded at familiar faces and walked to the counter. Mabel herself, a woman his age with steel gray hair and hands that could shape dough into miracles, smiled at him. The usual, "Harold, please." She poured his coffee. Black, no sugar. When he reached for his wallet, she waved him off. "On the house today." Behind him, an elderly woman with a cane approached, Dorothy Whitmore, who taught elementary school for 40 years and had taught both Harold and Martha in 2nd grade. "Harold Green," she said, "may I sit with you?" He gestured to the empty chair. She settled slowly, her joints audibly protesting. "I wanted to tell you," she began, then stopped. Her eyes, roomy with age, filled. She blinked the tears back. "When my husband died, I thought the world had become colorless, everything gray. I stopped noticing sunrises, stopped listening to music. Then my daughter brought me this ridiculous little dog, a thing that barely weighed 5 pounds and yapped at everything." She paused, sipped from her teacup. "That dog made me laugh, first time in months. Sometimes we need something small and ridiculous to remind us that life continues." Harold wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. The warmth spread through his palms. "I saw the photograph," Dorothy continued, "and I thought, yes, that's exactly it. That cat knows." She stood, patted his shoulder once, and walked out. Harold sat for a long time after his coffee grew cold. The grocery store was easier. People glanced at him, but no one approached. He bought his usual items: bread, milk, coffee, chicken, vegetables, cat food. At the register, Linda Martinez, who'd been working there since her kids were small and was now a grandmother, rang up his purchases without comment until the end. "That little one," she said quietly, "the Bobcat. You taking care of it, okay?" "Pumpkin's taking care of it." Linda smiled. "Of course she is." She handed him his change. My grandmother used to say that animals know grief better than people do. They know how to sit with it without trying to fix it. Harold carried his groceries to the truck. The parking lot was busy. Families loading carts, children running between cars. Normal life. The world had not stopped. It never did. At home. He unpacked the groceries while Pumpkin supervised from the counter, a place Martha had never allowed her but which Harold had given up enforcing. Whisker batted at a paper bag, attacking it with mock ferocity, hind legs kicking. Already the kitten was larger than it had been a week ago. Its movements were more coordinated, its mules deeper. Harold opened a can of cat food, split it between two bowls. Pumpkin ate delicately, pausing between bites. Whisker dove in face first, growling low in its throat even though no one was threatening its meal. Pumpkin glanced over, made a small chirping sound, and Whisker's growl stopped. The kitten continued eating, but quietly now. After dinner, Harold sat on the porch as the sun lowered behind the mountains. The view was one he'd looked at for decades but which he'd stopped seeing clearly after Martha died. Now he noticed the way light caught the new leaves, turned them luminous. The sound of the creek running high with spring melt. The particular quality of evening air. Still cool enough to carry the scent of pine. Pumpkin emerged from the house, Whisker following. They settled beside Harold's chair, Pumpkin grooming the kitten while the kitten's eyes grew heavy and slowly closed. Harold reached down, ran his hand over Pumpkin's back. Her purr rumbled up through his fingers. Something was shifting in him, like ice breaking up on a river. Not sudden, gradual, almost imperceptible until you noticed the water moving again. That night, he pulled out the old typewriter from the closet, Martha's typewriter. Really. She'd been the writer in the family, keeping journals, writing letters to friends and relatives, composing little poems that she'd leave around the house for him to find. The typewriter was a manual. Heavy, requiring force to press the keys. Harold hadn't touched it in years. He sat at the kitchen table, rolled in a sheet of paper, and stared at the blank page. His fingers found the keys slowly, unpracticed. He typed one sentence. The cat brought home something wild, and everything changed. He read it, pulled the paper out, rolled in another sheet. Pumpkin found the Bobcat kitten on a Tuesday morning. Better, more specific, more true. He continued. Words came slowly at first, then faster. He wrote about finding them on the porch, about calling wildlife services, about Pumpkin's certainty. He wrote for an hour, maybe two, when he finally stopped. His fingers ached and he had 3 pages of single-spaced text. He read them over. They weren't good. The sentences were clumsy, the descriptions plain, but they were honest. They were true. He put the pages in a folder and went to bed. The next morning, he woke to find Whisker on the bed for the first time, curled against Pumpkin on what had been Martha's pillow. He lay very still, not wanting to disturb them. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. Dust motes drifted. Whisker's ear twitched, responding to some dream. Harold thought about Dorothy Whitmore and her 5-pound dog, about the note from the Hendersons, about Linda Martinez's grandmother and animals knowing grief. He got up quietly, dressed, and returned to the typewriter. Over the following week, the attention diminished. A few cars still drove past, but fewer each day. The phone stopped ringing. The town moved on to other news, other stories. Harold continued writing. Some mornings he managed only a paragraph. Other days the words flowed, and he looked up to find hours had passed. He wrote about Martha, about the emptiness after she died, about mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible. He wrote about Pumpkin sleeping in the doorway, keeping watch. He wrote about Whisker's arrival, and how something that should have been another burden had instead been a strange gift. He wrote about watching Pumpkin teach Whisker to hunt moths that gathered around the porch light, about the time Whisker climbed the bookshelf and got stuck, about the morning he found them both in the garden, Pumpkin sitting dignified among the tomato plants, while Whisker rolled in the dirt, coating its spotted fur in dust. The writing was not beautiful. It was plain and direct. The words of a man who'd worked with his hands all his life and had never thought much about sentences and paragraphs. But it was true, and somehow, that mattered. One evening in late May, as twilight settled over the farm, Harold carried his chair outside and sat watching Pumpkin and Whisker in the yard. The kitten was nearly adolescent now, gangly and awkward. Paws too large for its body, it pounced on Pumpkin's tail. She swatted it away with one paw, not gently but not with claws extended. Whisker tumbled, righted itself, and immediately pounced again. This time Pumpkin stood, stretched, and walked toward the porch. Whisker followed. Suami shouted. They climbed the steps together and curled up on the old quilt. Whisker's head rested on Pumpkin's flank. Pumpkin's tail curved around the younger cat's body. In the fading light, their breathing synchronized. Harold picked up his notebook and pen. He wrote until dark, until he could no longer see the page. Then he went inside, made himself dinner, and sat at the table reading what he'd written. It was almost finished. Not a book. Exactly. Just a collection of moments, of observations, of a man learning to see again through the lens of two cats who didn't care about grief or healing or any of the words people used. They just lived. That seemed like enough. June arrived with heat that pressed down from a white sky. Harold woke each morning at 5, made coffee, and sat at the typewriter for 2 hours before the day grew too warm to think clearly. The stack of typed pages grew thicker. He kept them in a box that had once held Martha's yarn, her handwriting still visible on the side where she'd labeled it blue and green, winter projects. Whisker had grown large enough that Pumpkin could no longer pin it during their evening wrestling matches. The young Bobcat was all muscle and coiled energy, ears alert to every sound in the woods behind the house. Yet when Pumpkin chirped, that low, trilling sound cats make to their young, Whisker would immediately lower its head and approach for grooming. Harold wrote about this, about the language between them that required no words. By mid-July, he had what he thought might be a complete manuscript. He read it through in one sitting, making marks with a pencil where sentences ran together or thoughts felt incomplete. The next morning he typed the corrections. Then he sat staring at the box, unsure what came next. The Willow Creek Library was a small brick building on Oak Street, cool inside even during summer. Mrs. Patricia Cole had run it for 30 years. She looked up from her desk when Harold entered, surprise flickering across her face before she smiled. "Harold Green, I haven't seen you here since Martha used to drag me to book club." She did love a good argument about literature. Patricia stood, walked around the desk. "What can I help you with?" Harold set the box on the counter. "I wrote something, don't know if it's any good, don't really know what to do with it." Patricia opened the box, lifted the top page, read the first paragraph, then the second. She pulled out a chair. "Give me a few minutes." Harold wandered the stacks while she read. The library smelled like old paper and floor wax, a combination that brought back memories of childhood, of his mother bringing him here on Saturday mornings. He pulled out a book at random, opened it, saw words but didn't read them. 20 minutes later, Patricia called him back. Her reading glasses hung on a chain around her neck. She'd removed them to rub her eyes. "Harold, this is remarkable. It's just what happened." Exactly. She tapped the pages. "That's why it works. You're not trying to make it bigger than it is. You're just telling the truth." She paused. "Have you thought about publishing it?" "Don't know anything about that." "I know someone." She wrote a name and address on a piece of notepaper. "Angela Morrison. She runs a small press that focuses on regional stories, memoirs, that sort of thing. They published a collection from a woman in Boone about raising sheep. Sold very well in the area." Harold took the paper, folded it, put it in his pocket. "I'll mail it to her if you'd like," Patricia offered. "I can write a cover letter, tell her why I think she should read it." Harold looked at the box, at the pages that contained everything he'd felt and feared to say out loud, at the words that had somehow made the shape of his grief visible and therefore bearable. "All right," Patricia smiled. "Leave it with me. I'll send it tomorrow." Walking home, Harold felt lighter and heavier simultaneously. He'd let something go. Now he had to wait to see if it mattered to anyone besides himself. August came. Whisker had grown too large for the house. It knocked things over turning around, sent books flying off shelves with its tail, left scratches on the furniture that Harold told himself he didn't mind, but which made him wince each time. More concerning were the moments when Whisker would freeze, staring at something only it could see. muscles tensed for a hunt that had nothing to do with moths or paper bags. Harold called Wildlife Services again. This time they responded quickly, sending a woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez who wore hiking boots and carried a radio. She was young, maybe 30, with sun-darkened skin and capable hands. She sat on the porch watching Whisker stalk a butterfly. Pumpkin watched too, from her spot on the railing, tail twitching with what might have been pride or concern or both. "That's a healthy juvenile," Dr. Martinez said. "Maybe 8 months old now. Growing fast?" "Too fast," Harold said. "There's a facility about 15 miles from here. Semi-wild reserve, part of the National Forest land. We use it for animals that can't be fully released but shouldn't be in captivity either. Fenced acreage, natural prey. They live mostly wild, but with monitoring." She glanced at him. "It's where this one should be." Harold had known this was coming, had known since the beginning. Probably. Still, the words settled like stones in his chest. When soon? Another month and it'll be too territorial to relocate safely. That evening, Harold sat on the porch longer than usual. Pumpkin and Whisker lay together on the quilt, Whisker's breathing deep and even in sleep. Pumpkin's eyes were open, reflecting moonlight. She looked at Harold, blinked slowly. He wondered what she understood, what she knew was coming. The letter from Angela Morrison arrived in mid-August. Harold stood at the mailbox, reading it twice before walking back to the house. She wanted to publish the manuscript, thought it would resonate with readers, offered a small advance, and talked about distribution to bookstores in the region. Maybe beyond. She'd edited the manuscript lightly. She wrote, mostly for clarity, wanted to title it Love Beyond Fur and Claws, unless he objected. Harold didn't object. He called the number at the bottom of the letter. A woman answered, her voice warm and professional. They talked for 30 minutes. She asked questions about Pumpkin and Whisker, about Martha, about why he'd written it. Harold answered simply. When they finished, she said, "This is going to touch people, Mr. Green. I'm certain of it." Harold wanted to believe her. Mostly he felt tired and uncertain and like he'd exposed something he should have kept private. Dr. Martinez came back in September with a transport crate and a mild sedative. Whisker fought the crate initially, then Pumpkin walked over, pressed her head through the bars, and made that trilling sound. Whisker calmed, lay down, kept its eyes on Pumpkin until the sedative took effect and they closed. The truck pulled away. Harold stood in the driveway with Pumpkin in his arms. She was tense, claws digging through his shirt. He held her until the dust settled and the sound of the engine faded. Then he carried her inside and set her on the couch. She jumped down immediately, walked through every room of the house, calling. The sound was plaintive and questioning, and it broke something in Harold he'd been holding together. He picked up the phone, called Patricia at the library, and asked if she wanted to have coffee sometime. She said yes. The book came out in November. Angela Morrison had worked quickly. The cover showed a simple photograph, not of Pumpkin and Whisker, but of an empty porch with a quilt folded on the steps. Inside, the pages were clean and white. Harold's words looked different in print, more official somehow, more real. Angela sent him 20 copies. Harold gave one to Patricia, one to Dorothy Whitmore, one to Mabel at the coffee shop. He kept the rest in the box where the manuscript had been. Within 2 weeks, the bookstore in town had sold out of its initial order. Then orders came from Asheville, from Raleigh, from bookstores Harold had never heard of. Angela called weekly with updates. A book club in Charlotte had selected it. A retirement community in Durham wanted him to come speak. A newspaper in Winston-Salem had reviewed it, calling it a quiet meditation on grief and unexpected grace. Harold didn't know what to do with any of this. The letters started arriving in December, people writing to tell him their own stories. A woman in Georgia whose cat had adopted a squirrel. A man in Tennessee who'd lost his wife and found comfort in the stray dog that appeared at his door. A couple in Virginia who read the book aloud to each other, chapter by chapter, because it reminded them of their own journey through loss. Harold read every letter, answered most of them. His handwriting was cramped and unpracticed, but he tried to respond to each person as if they were sitting across from him at the kitchen table. He thanked them, told them their stories mattered, wished them well. In January, He drove to the retirement community in Durham for his first speaking event. 50 people filled a common room, most of them his age or older, some using walkers, some with oxygen tanks. He stood at a small podium with note cards he'd prepared but didn't need. He told them about Pumpkin finding Whisker, about the silence after Martha died, about how writing had helped him understand what he'd been through. He read a passage from the book, the one about watching Pumpkin teach Whisker to wash itself. The older cat patient and persistent while the kitten squirmed and protested. When he finished, an elderly man in the back row raised his hand. "Does Whisker ever come back?" Harold hesitated. He hadn't written about this part yet because it was still happening, still uncertain. "Yes," he said finally. "Not often, but yes." The first time Whisker returned was on a Wednesday in February. Harold was in the garden, turning soil for spring planting, when Pumpkin made a sound he'd never heard before, sharp and urgent. He looked up to see her standing at attention, staring toward the woods. The bobcat emerged from the tree line slowly, full-grown now, powerful shoulders and long legs, moving with the confidence of a predator. Harold froze. The cat crossed the meadow, covering ground with easy strides, stopped at the edge of the yard. Pumpkin jumped down from the porch, walked forward, sat, waited. Whisker approached, lowered its head, pressed its forehead against Pumpkin's. They stayed like that for a long moment. Then Whisker lay down, belly exposed, and Pumpkin began grooming its face. Harold watched from the garden. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. They stayed together for an hour. Then Whisker stood, touched noses with Pumpkin once more, and walked back toward the woods. At the tree line it paused, looked back. Harold raised his hand in what might have been greeting or farewell, or simply acknowledgement. The bobcat turned and disappeared. Pumpkin returned to the porch. Curled up on the quilt, slept. Harold finished turning the soil, his hands were shaking slightly. That evening he added another page to what was becoming a new manuscript. The speaking invitations continued. Harold accepted some, declined others. He learned to talk about the book without talking too much about himself. Learned to answer questions thoughtfully. Learned that people wanted hope, not answers. They wanted to know that after loss came something else, even if that something was small and ordinary and involved a house cat cleaning a wild animal's ears. The literary award nomination arrived in March. Harold had to read the letter 3 times to understand what it meant. Patricia explained it to him over coffee. It was a significant honor. Meant the book had reached people beyond the local community. Meant his story mattered on a larger scale. Harold felt mostly bewildered and a little proud. Martha would have been proud. That thought made him smile. Whisker returned twice more before spring. Once in March during a late snowstorm, appearing on the porch like a ghost, snow clinging to its fur, and once in April, carrying something in its mouth that it laid carefully beside Pumpkin's water bowl. A pine cone, perfectly intact. Harold kept it. He started a box labeled Gifts from Pumpkin's Wild Child and added to it each time Whisker left something. A feather, a piece of bark, a smooth river stone. Small offerings that proved memory ran deeper than instinct. In May, the town council voted to install a statue in the Central Park. Harold attended the meeting. Uncomfortable in a suit jacket Patricia had convinced him to buy. The mayor, a woman named Jennifer Walsh who'd been in Martha's book club, spoke about community identity and stories that defined who they were as people. The statue would depict Pumpkin curled around a young bobcat, cast in bronze. The inscription would read, "Love knows no species." They asked if Harold would speak at the unveiling. He said yes, because Martha would have wanted him to, and because these people had embraced his story as their own. The unveiling happened in June, a year after he had started writing. More than 100 people attended. Children sat in the grass. Elderly couples held hands. Families spread blankets. The statue stood covered beneath a blue tarp. Harold spoke briefly. Said the statue honored not just Pumpkin and Whisker, but something larger. The capacity for care, for crossing boundaries, for loving without requiring it to make sense. They pulled away the tarp. The statue caught afternoon light. Pumpkin's bronze ears were alert. Whisker's spots were carefully detailed. They looked almost alive. People applauded. Children ran forward to touch the statue. Harold stepped back, let the crowd surround it, and found himself standing next to Patricia. Martha would have loved this, she said quietly. She would have thought it was ridiculous. Well, yes, but she would have loved it anyway. Harold smiled. This was true. That evening, Whisker returned again, sat on the porch steps beside Pumpkin at exactly 5 o'clock, the time Harold always came home from town. Both cats watched the road when Harold's truck appeared, pulling into the driveway. Whisker stood. So did Pumpkin. Harold got out of the truck slowly, his joints stiff from standing too long at the ceremony. The cats waited. He walked up the porch steps, sat in his chair. Pumpkin jumped into his lap. Whisker lay down beside the chair, close enough that Harold could reach down and touch its head. He did. The fur was coarse and thick. Whisker's eyes half closed. For a moment, everything was perfectly still. Then the bobcat stood, touched its nose to Pumpkin's paw, and walked into the gathering dusk. Pumpkin watched it go. So did Harold. Neither moved until the shape disappeared into shadow. That night, Harold sat at the typewriter and wrote his final entry, "If a cat can adopt a bobcat, if motherhood can cross species, and if the aging heart of an old man can beat again, then perhaps this world is not yet out of miracles." He read it over, pulled the page from the typewriter, added it to the stack. The manuscript was finished. Love Beyond Fur and Claws would have a sequel, he supposed. Or maybe not a sequel, just a continuation, because the story hadn't ended. It was still happening. Would keep happening as long as Whisker returned, as long as Pumpkin waited, as long as Harold sat on his porch in the evenings watching light fade behind the mountains. Summer arrived. Pumpkin moved slower now, slept longer, her orange fur graying around the muzzle. But every time Whisker returned, she would rise, walk to meet it, groom its face with the same patient attention she'd given when it was a kitten. And Whisker, powerful enough now to take down deer, would lower its head and accept the care. Harold documented these visits, photographed them, wrote about them, added pages to what would become the second book. But mostly he just watched, just witnessed, just allowed himself to feel grateful for whatever time remained. On a Wednesday in July, Whisker brought Pumpkin up the porch steps when she struggled to climb them alone. The bobcat walked beside her, shoulder pressed against her shoulder, guiding her up each board. Harold stood in the doorway watching. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. Later, Patricia asked him what that felt like. He thought for a long time before answering. Like watching someone you love be loved by someone else you love. She wrote it down, told him it would be a good line for the new book. Harold didn't know if there would be a new book. Didn't know what came next for any of them. Pumpkin was 23 years old. Each day with her was borrowed time. Whisker was wild now, truly wild, returning because it chose to, not because it needed to. And Harold himself was 75, his body reminding him daily of its limitations. But on evenings when the three of them sat together on the porch, Whisker's breathing synchronized with Pumpkin's, both of them resting against Harold's chair. He thought maybe the story didn't need an ending. Maybe it had just needed to be witnessed, to be remembered, to be written down so that others might know what he had learned. That love was not reasonable or explainable or bound by the categories people tried to place around it. That grief could be survived, though never fully left behind. That sometimes the heart healed not through dramatic gestures, but through small, persistent acts of care. That a house cat could mother a bobcat. That a wild animal could remember where it was raised. That an old man could learn to feel again. These were not miracles. They were simply what happened when one paid attention, when one remained open, when one allowed the world to be strange and surprising and more generous than expected. Harold closed his eyes, rested his hand on Pumpkin's back, felt Whisker's warmth against his leg. The evening air smelled of pine and coming rain. Somewhere in the woods, an owl called. Another answered. This was enough. This was everything. This was the story he would tell until he had no more stories to tell. And even then, the telling would continue. In the statue in the park, in the books on library shelves, in the letters from strangers who'd found in his words an echo of their own hearts. The world had not run out of miracles. It had simply been waiting for him to notice them again.